work in the European Union on different areas is based on the principle of transfer of powers. Only the powers that have been transferred by the member states to the European Union through the treaties are areas in which the European Commission can take initiatives and act. All other areas not conferred remain responsibility of the member states. One of the areas that in which I working is the European disability policy. And you might ask why disability policy at EU level when the main responsibility of disability issues lies with the member states. It is for two main reasons, because first, people with disabilities in Europe have similar concerns throughout the whole European Union. They face the same obstacles, barriers, they face discrimination, and the rights are the same across the Union. The second is that policies, funding and legislation that it is undertaken by the Union have an impact on all people with disabilities across the EU. The EU is a party to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities since 2011. The convention has been signed by all the member states and ratified by 25. The obligations in the convention concern the European Union and the member states. The convention is part of the EU legal order. This means that it lays between the treaties and the secondary legislation. So whenever the European Union is implementing the treaties through secondary legislation, directives, regulations, programs, the convention needs to be respected in the EU. In order to implement the convention, the European Commission presented the European Disability Strategy 2010-2020 with a double-fold approach. First, to empower persons with disabilities to enjoy the full rights across the EU, and second, to create a barrier-free Europe. It provides with a strategic and multi-annual framework to facilitate the implementation in the EU, but also to support the member states in their implementation. It contains 8 main areas of action. The first one being accessibility. Others are participation, equality, employment, education and training, social protection, equal access to health, and external action. The strategy was accompanied by a concrete list of actions, and it works by providing a mix of instruments, legislation, mainstreaming, through general policies, cooperation among stakeholders. It provides also for a governance framework, and it addresses the issue of funding disability matters through targeted actions, but also the mainstreaming of those actions, the funding of the mainstreaming actions. It caters for information exchange, and it contains some actions which deal with awareness raising, reporting about disabilities. It contains the possibility to carry out studies on particular areas related to the convention and the EU competencies, and it devotes particular attention to data collection and monitoring as well as training. But let me go back to accessibility being the first area of the strategy. In the work of the Commission, the European Commission, accessibility is considered as a wide concept That includes the prevention and elimination of obstacles that pose problems for persons with disabilities in using products, services, and infrastructure. It is important to note that the UN Convention does not provide for a specific definition. It, however, indicates a number of obligations for state parties. The UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, through jurisprudence and a specific comment provided on accessibility, has clarified that state parties need to create legislative frameworks with concrete and enforceable and time-bound benchmarks for monitoring and assessing the gradual modifications and adjustments for accessibility. It is important to understand all the obligations of Article 9, as well as the general obligation on accessibility under this light. Accessibility is a concept that we use in the context of different types of legislation. Sometimes it is used in the non-discrimination framework, sometimes it is used in sectorial legislation, and sometimes it's just concrete obligations on accessibility that are put in a specific legislation. But it is important that to understand the convention is about having persons with disabilities enjoying their rights. And as such, in order to do so, accessibility is a precondition for that enjoyment of rights. The intention is to go from the enjoyment of rights to avoid discrimination, in fact, to have the provision of equal access, that equality to access, to enjoyment of rights is the ultimate aim, and accessibility is a precondition for that. Accessibility normally is implemented following a design for all approach or a universal design approach. Accessibility addresses the main known concerns that various groups of persons with disabilities have. But in order to achieve the purpose of equal access, for the enjoyment of rights, accessibility is not enough. There will always be the need of having reasonable accommodation together with accessibility. Reasonable accommodation, assistive technologies, or even the provision of personal assistance. It is with this tandem of accessibility with reasonable accommodation only together, when they work and operate in a seamless manner, that accessibility and that equal access can be achieved. At EU level, we have got accessibility, we have implemented accessibility through different strategies, either through thematic approaches. For example, in transport legislation, it is well known the European legislation, for example, addressing low-platform buses. We also have got some thematic legislation in the area of telecommunications. There is also some funding, accessibility through funding, and one of the elements is, or one of the instruments, sorry, is public procurement, or the provision of specific funding programs in order to include accessibility or to remove barriers for accessibility, like, for example, the European structural funds. Other actions to improve accessibility related to research or standardization, where efforts have been undertaken to have common harmonized approaches across Europe. Let me focus a little bit on the legislation of accessibility. We have a very complex framework and complete framework. We have anti-discrimination directives in the context of employment, and on access to goods and services, a directive is being negotiated with member states. The public procurement directives makes it compulsory since last year to purchase accessible for public authorities. Whenever they buy goods, services that are going to be used by people, whether internal employees of the public administrations or the public itself, those goods and services need to be accessible. The structural funds is one of the biggest European funds, and requires that in all expenditures, in all the process of spending the funds, accessibility needs to be considered. An equivalent obligation relates to the trans-European networks. Those are networks that aim to connect different parts of Europe. I mentioned already also some specific legislation. And we have, since recent, also a common implementing regulation for external action that requires also accessibility. This means that funds spent for development cooperation also need to be spent respecting accessibility. Since recent, the Commission has made a proposal for web accessibility for public sector websites, which is also being discussed with the member states. And finally, I would like to mention the European Accessibility Act that aims to be a business-friendly initiative for improving the functioning of internal market for accessible goods and services. We are working on this area, and we will soon be ready, we hope. Let me focus a little bit in the anti-discrimination legislation, just to highlight to you that in approaching equal treatment under the anti-discrimination framework, the directive makes it very clear that for the provision of equal treatment, both accessibility in an anticipatory manner, that means before persons with disabilities are confronted with the access of goods and services, and reasonable accommodation as a reactive solution for bridging the gap of the general accessibility measures, both need to be provided for persons with disabilities. I already mentioned the public procurement directives, and let me go a little bit more deep into those directives, the obligations in those directives. The directives make very clear that whenever public authorities draft their call for tenders, the technical specifications for the call for tenders, accessibility needs to be there. It provides for the possibility of having quality assurance standards on accessibility, and it clarifies the possibility of using accessibility as one of the award criteria. The award, using accessibility in the award criteria permits the competition on accessibility. Public authorities can grant additional value to accessibility and select the most accessible products or services. This means that accessibility can be converted in a competitive factor for the bidders to get their bid selected. In order to facilitate the process of writing those call for tenders or referring to accessibility, the European Commission has started to work on standardization. We have a standard on on ICT, accessible ICT, and on the way there are standards for accessible built environment and for the mainstreaming of accessibility following design for all in standardization. Let me stress that standards are voluntary documents, and while the Commission has asked for those standards to be written in a way that can be used in public procurement, they can also be used for other purposes. Member states, for example, could use it in legislation, they could be used as guidance material. So the use of public procurement is just one of the uses that those standards in ICT and in the making art. As I mentioned, there are three ongoing mandates that are going to help very much the implementation of accessibility in a coherent way in Europe. Standardization is a very important instrument for accessibility policies, and that's why we have also made some efforts to train the stakeholders, both users, persons with disabilities, so that they are knowledgeable, they become knowledgeable on accessibility, also on standardization, and standardizers, so that they get familiar with accessibility and disability policies. In that way, dialogue and consensus can be facilitated. Let me finish by saying that our aim is not to reinvent the wheel on accessibility, but use as much as possible existing accessibility standards. In that context, I would like to mention the dialogue that the European Union is having with the US, particularly with the Access Board, mainly with the Access Board and some other federal agencies like the General Service Administrations, the Federal Communication Commission, and NIST, the Department of Commerce, in order to bring coherence to the standards at both sides of the Atlantic. The main conclusions of the work that we are doing in this area is the need to have a comprehensive framework of accessibility based on human rights, as the Convention is saying. We have shown that we have started to develop a policy framework, a legal framework that builds on one hand on sector legislation and non-discrimination provisions with the objective to provide equal access. In those processes, in those pieces of legislation, what we observe and what we get feedback of functioning legislative measures is that they need to have clear responsibility assigned and details on what accessibility is, preferable from a functional perspective, but linked to technical standards to have the technical details. There need to be adequate timeframes that are realistic, yet that provide a clear advance over the state of the art. Standards, as mentioned, play an important role, and preferably they should be linked also with research outcomes. The standards are about consensus, but the consensus-weighted positions, it needs to be better associated by the outcomes of research. The involvement of users and the technical expertise of those participating in the process is essential for the success of the results. Users are asking for effective enforcement and redress mechanisms. It should be possible to put complaints that lead to improvements and compensation where needed. At least that improvements, remedial actions are taken when accessibility barriers are identified or failure to comply with the legislation. The public sector has a key role to play by providing funding, and by leading by example through their procurement practices. The private sector needs to be stimulated to do what better they do, which is provide innovative solutions, compete among themselves, and ensure and comply with the rules that are set in the market. Finally, in order to ensure an effective implementation, monitoring and protection of rights is essential. Monitoring to see that the problems, the barriers existing are being removed, and that no new barriers are entered into the market. My last slide refers to an action that we are undertaking to reward those European cities that have undertaken innovative work on accessibility. Let me say that a lot is happening across Europe to improve accessibility. So every year we provide an award called the Access City Award to cities that have played an exemplary role on improving accessibility. The first year was 2011, and the prize went to a medieval city with medieval walls that have been made accessible. The next year they went to Salzburg with the city center fully adapted for persons with disabilities. Berlin did major efforts to make accessibility sustainable in their development. And last year, Gothenburg, 2014, Gothenburg got the award for their continuous and sustained accessibility solutions being done through a universal design approach. I will leave you now. I thank the organizers, and if my slides are distributed, there are some links to the documents that I have been mentioning through my presentation. Thank you very much.